applause.
감사합니다. 다음은 자본시장연구원 이상호.
Next, we'd like to invite Lee Sang-ho from the Research Fellow of Korea Capital Market Institute to talk to us about mandatory public disclosure on ESG management.
네, 안녕하십니까?
Yes, hello. As introduced, I am Lee Sang-ho from the Korea Capital Market Institute. I'd like to talk about how we can make improvements in the information disclosure systems so that we can further promote corporate ESG management activities. So I'll explain the overall background and review the disclosure levels of ESG for our Korean companies, and lastly discuss how we can improve this with some suggestions at the end. European Union will be introducing a carbon tax, border tax from 2026. The Bank of Korea has estimated a $50 custom taxation for every ton of carbon emission. This is not going to be covered by most of the companies that are in Korea and also exporting to the European Union. There are growing needs for more information to be disclosed on the corporate ESG activities. The government has announced plans to declare how the ESG corporate disclosures is going to be made to whom and by when. So by 2030, all companies in the listed stock market will be mandated to disclose their ESG activities. When it comes to the how part, we still need more discussions. There are multiple report criteria and standards. Every institution is demanding different levels of information from different companies. There are no set systematic measures. The coalition of the ESG combined grading is only 0.61 compared to 0.9 of the much trusted, widely used credit rating. As far as how the corporate disclosure is going to be conducted, the KRX has already produced a guidance. And they have presented 21 key indexes and best practices. However, since this is the first time that the disclosure standards of ESG is being presented, there are still very differing views on when and how the scope of the disclosure mandates. Some people say that 2030 is too delayed. Some people say that asking for only the listed companies is too narrow, and some say that 21 indexes is too little. However, we must make sure that we must understand that the ultimate goal is already set. That is to adopt the IFRS ESG reporting standards. Since we already have IFRS adopted in Korea, it only makes sense to integrate the internationally acknowledged standards in the ESG as well, reflecting the IFRS standards. So that is our ultimate goal, and we need to think about how we can reach that. The question is, how can we maintain, is it okay for us to maintain the current disclosure systems until the IFRS standard is being implemented? Because we believe at the earliest it will be the first half of next year that the IFRS's guidelines will be made public. So how can we prepare in the meantime would be an important issue. So let's look at the ESG disclosure levels of the Korean companies. So there are companies that are doing ESG very actively. It's most likely for us to assume that they are doing a lot of disclosure activities as well. if you are a company that is not fully involved in the ESG activities yet, likelihood is you will not be disclosing your information as much. So the policies need to be made based on a better understanding of what the companies are doing. ESG basically aims to make the companies pay for the social cost that so far the society has borne the burden of. So studies have been conducted to see how the companies can bear that social cost. So we divided the good performers and the bad performers. So the good performers can bear the burden of the social cost because that amount is only 2% or lower than 2% of their operating profit, whereas the bad performers have the social cost that exceeds more than 100% of their operating cost. So comparing the good performers and the bad performers, we find that 17.5% of the listed companies that are subject to carbon trading as of 2019 are bad performers. If you go into the non-listed companies, that portion jumps to almost 27.8%. So if you look at the good performers and the bad performers in the listed companies, we studied what kind of characteristics they show in terms of market cap, revenue. The bad performers tended to be small and medium-sized companies, whereas the good performers were the conglomerates, large companies. Revenue-wise, the bad performers only make 1/4 of the good performers, but they produce 32.4 times more carbon emissions than the good performers. The carbon compensation cost also was 19.4 billion won for the bad performers, whereas it was only 7 billion won for the good performers. The bad performers were found more in the stock market than the securities market. So how are they doing in terms of disclosure? We looked at their homepage, and you can see that the good performers are way outperforming the bad performers in terms of already disclosing their information on their homepage, especially when it comes to GRI, TCFD, and SASB. The good performers are doing far more disclosure than the bad performers. The bad performers have very low operating margin. They emit a lot of pollution materials, and they are constantly exposed to risks related to that. But only 10% of these companies actually disclosed that information. So these companies, they're actually at the risk of having to bear more burden with the changed regulations. As for the safety protection activities for their workers, again, with the SAPA, the businesses are recognizing this as a clear threat to the business, but very few companies have actually disclosed how they're going to make improvements in this sector. And also, we looked at how the companies are presenting any predictable information being disclosed. Again, related to very few companies in the carbon capture or renewable energy were the very few cases where they actually presented disclosure for those predictable businesses, and they were also very limited to the good performance. Of course, theoretically, it might not make sense or be even good to disclose every single detail. But we do conclude that the overall disclosure level of, in terms of ESG, needs to be improved than what we see right now, especially with the global trend of more ESG disclosures and regulations stepping up. We need to do better. In the United States, Europe, China, Hong Kong, Japan, in all areas, ESG-related regulations and disclosure mandate is becoming strengthened. The EU, in particular, emphasizing the ESG risk factors in terms of the supply chain. So basically, they're saying companies who have low response to ESG, the EU is saying do not share the value chain with those companies. So this is an area where our low performers definitely need to look into and have really a transparent disclosure to the outside stakeholders. Although Korea's current plan is being criticized as being too delayed, too narrow, and not sufficient enough, we're all in this as a new starter. So Europe, in the US, they are still sticking to more voluntary-based disclosure systems. So we need to think about what will be the most effective way to get the best information for these disclosures. If you do not disclose enough ESG information, it's going to just send out a negative signal to the outside stakeholders, and it's just going to have a negative impact on the corporate value. So we need to think about the optimal level of disclosure so that we can promote more companies to voluntarily disclose ESG information. We can naturally see that the good performers with very relatively better ESG response measures are actually disclosing more of their ESG information. So peer pressure is definitely going to kick in. And if you look at the relevant research, there are numerous interpretations and value-based judgment in connection to the ESG information. So actually there are studies where excessive amount of information demotes the objectivity of the ESG-related evaluations. Since Korea is not in the position to lead the international ESG reporting standards, it would not make sense for us to present an independent evaluation standard and bring forth the enforced disclosure process. And even if we did implement our own independent rule, then we would have to go through another phase of interpreting that information to match that of the international standards. So we need to really look at all aspects and see which would be the most effective and most optimal way of introducing a ESG disclosure standard for the Korean situation. So if the disclosure is mandated, as we see in the EU case, it actually has a negative correlation to the corporate value because it definitely entails more additional cost to be borne by the companies. However, if you are a company, if you're a good performer that are used to voluntary disclosures even before any regulations were set in place, and if you're a good performer with high response level to ESG issues, mandating the disclosure actually promotes or improves your corporate values. So again, different impact, different interpretations are possible. So we really need to balance out what would be the most optimal solution, how it can be complemented to have some voluntary disclosures and enforced disclosures upon discretion. In all rate, we must mandate a minimum level of ESG information disclosure to all businesses and leave more detailed disclosure in the realm of voluntary disclosure so that companies can work to gain the trust of the markets through its voluntary, transparent disclosure of their information.
이 사건 이후로 SEC가 새로운 규제를 도입하는 건수가 유의미하게 줄어들었습니다. 그만큼 어떠한 정책을 추진할 때에는
There are cases
이행 부담에 대한 공정하고 충실한
where
필요하다.
policy introduction resulted in negative outputs. So with the current limitations or the current situations that we have, we must find the most optimal
먼저 중요 ESG 정보는 사업 보고서상 사업의 내용 또는
level for implementation.
의무화할 필요성이 있습니다. ESG를 강조하는 국제 경제 질서 변화는 수출 비중이나 중간재 생산이 높은 국내 기업을 중심으로 재무적 위험성과 직결되는 중대한 사안입니다.
For the ESG information that is necessary for protection of the investors needs to be made mandatory for disclosure. Since the international economic order is changing towards emphasizing or heightening the importance of ESG, we need to be aware that domestic companies that have high export ratio or works as a secondary or intermediary producer in the international community, their disclosure will have a direct impact on their financial security. Also, the bad performers must be regulated so that they comply to various ESG-related regulations with the goal of protecting the investors.
투자 판단에 필요한 실질적인 사항들에 대해서는 아무런 답을 내릴 수가 없기 때문에 좀 예측 요소가 포함이
We need to have more predictable elements included in the ESG disclosure indexes. We also will need a certification system
유럽연합 기업들 같은 경우에 비재무 정보에 대한 그 평균적인 예상 인증 비용을
so that and also monitoring will be required.
수준에 따라서 좀
Of course, it's always the issue of cost. How much is this going to cost the businesses?
매년 발생할 것으로 추산.
On average, European companies are spending about 23 million Korean won up to 38 million Korean won per year for various certification issues. So with that in mind, we must set a realistic level of cost for various certification-related expenses.
마지막으로 기존의 사업 보고서 공시, 거래소 공시, 개별 법상 공시로 여러 근거 규정에 따라서
We already have various legal measures that require companies to disclose their business activities,
공시 채널을 일원화할 필요가 있어 보입니다.
and we believe that this can be consolidated along with the discussion of having an ESG information disclosure standards being prepared.
엄밀한 어떤 실증 분석 자체가 불가능한 상황이기 때문에 철저히 가치
So,
판단의 영역이고
This still requires more research,
합리적인 방안은 얼마든지 있을 수
and there can always be a better, more reasonable proposal that can be made.
경영을 잘하는 것과
However,
어떻게 공시할 것인가 하는 부분은 좀 다른 차원의 문제라는 점은 인식할
doing good ESG management and
많은 분들께서
doing good disclosure might not always go hand in hand. So this also should be considered when companies and the government and the regulatory bodies discuss this topic. Thank you very much for your attention.
감사합니다. 연구위원님 소중한 정보
Thank you for that presentation.
시간 관계에서 한 가지 질문을 드리는데요.
Just going to ask you one final question.
조금 중복이 될 수도 있어요.
It might overlap with your last comment.
최소화하자는 것이 과연 실용성이 있을지 이렇게
To minimize the mandatory disclosure elements, is that going to be effective? Will that be enough? I would say it's a legitimate question, and I think it's a question that arises mainly because we don't have that trust level yet. I mean, the question of really, will the companies take voluntary measures if the disclosure is required to a minimum? But once the companies understand that transparent disclosure will only add to their corporate value in earning more trust of the market and of the investors, there's no reason why they shouldn't disclose more information on their ESG activities. Thank you very much.
네, 연구위원님의 말씀처럼 이 모든 것이 과도기가
Yes, everything is in the making. We're in a very turbulent transition time.
교수님을 모셔